Good evening. We are delighted to have such a large audience today, and sorry for the slight delay. We were trying to sort out the technology. So welcome to the second webinar organized by the Social Scientists Against the Hostile Environment, SSAHE Collective. The SSAHE stem out of a special interest group on refugees, migration and settlement of the Academy of Social Sciences that was born in 2015 at the peak of the so-called humanitarian refugee crisis in the Mediterranean region. My name is Nando Sigona. I'm professor of international migration and forced displacement at the University of Birmingham, and I'm co-chairing today's webinar with my colleague Baria Kemal from the University of Kent. She was going to speak in a second. So we are really delighted to have such a distinguished panel today, and we are going to introduce each speaker in turn. So each speaker is going to speak for about 10 minutes, and then we're going to have a discussion in the end. We will tell you how to pose your question in a second. The topic of today is racism, policing, and the politics of surveillance in times of pandemic. Racism is ingrained in our societies, which are built on historically defined regime of racialized oppression accumulation. It inflicts violence and structural disadvantage on racialized citizens and migrants. The brutal murder of George Floyd in police custody is the tip of an iceberg made of hundreds of Black and minority ethnic lives who are daily subjected not only to police violence, but also silenced by a judicial system that is unwilling to protect them. The COVID-19 pandemic has in many ways revealed even more the social inequality that is underpinning our society, and it's also highlighted through the escalation of the state surveillance capability and monitoring capability, possibility for new forms of oppression and discrimination. All the new digital tools infiltrate our daily lives, and far from being neutral or colorblind, as a representative of the tech industries often claim, they codify and replicate existing racial hierarchies, strengthening pervasive system of racial oppression and surveillance. This has been recently shown, for example, in the work by Ruth Benjamin, Race After Technology, how racism is hidden behind codes and algorithms, and it's our role as a social scientist to contribute to develop conceptual tools to decode them. Our speakers will approach this topic from a range of different perspectives and standpoints. The event is going to be live on Zoom and YouTube, and we will make it available soon after also on our website. So now I'll give the floor to my colleague Baria.
Hi everyone. So as Nando said, the webinar brings together a range of perspectives on racism, policing, and the politics of surveillance. As you have seen in the publicity material, we open by thinking about and addressing a humanistic perspective. So the perspective of the lived experiences in and through social space, where we gave examples of narratives in our publicity material, as you can see on the screen. Narratives, powerful narratives by Jamaican-born artists and poets who captured their own and others' everyday lived experiences of racism within the UK, the US, and across the world. So we've got the example from the dub poet Lyndon Kwesi Johnson, who draws on the 90s moment in the UK, Claudia Rankine's example from 2014 that draws on racism from US and across the world, where they're capturing experiences of abuse by police who are defined as having the license to kill, or as Rankine states, Black men are dying because white men are not policing their imagination. And then we have a more recent image by Leroy Letts, Eyes of a Cloud, that captures his own experiences of being subject to surveillance fueled by big technological innovations that give the clouds eyes to watch him and others like him. So of course, all of these examples are capturing actual everyday lived experiences, just like that of George Floyd, that triggers narratives, powerful narratives that move the masses and have triggered the more recent global social movement and protests united behind the banner of Black Lives Matter, where together people are calling out all of these names of people who cannot breathe and are subject to violence and silence by systems that abuse their power and that did not protect them. So our webinar, like we said, brings together a range of perspectives that relate to these experiences, and particularly drawing on social scientists, academics and activists who draw on the impact of COVID-19 pandemic on new and existing forms of racism, analyze the spaces and geographies that make and break Black lives, examine policing of Black and minority ethnic groups and the changing politics of surveillance, and most importantly, help us think about alternative ways to read, construct, and remap the contemporary moment and everyday life lived experiences so as to police those imaginations of the racist mind to take responsibility and accountability for their actions. As Nando said, in terms of the structure, our 4 speakers will go in order of our publicity material. Each speaker will speak for about 10 minutes or so, and there we will end about 5:50. Then we will open the floor for questions. Question-wise, 2 options. One, if you're in the Zoom chat, please post your questions into the chat box, which will come directly to the co-host, to myself, and I'll be monitoring it. If you're viewing from YouTube Live, our colleague Rachel Humphreys is collating the questions there, and please do post there. So thank you so much. I'll now hand you over to Nando to introduce our first fantastic speaker for the evening.
Thank you very much, Maria. So our first speaker is Gracie May Bradley from Liberty. Gracie is a policy and campaign manager at Liberty, where she leads and campaigns on policing, immigration, counterterrorism, and surveillance. She was also involved in the Ada Lovelace Institute Rethinking Data Working Groups, and in a number of other initiatives working on the use of data. So she's particularly well positioned to reflect also to the new politics of surveillance, which is emerging in the context of the pandemic. Gracie, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. It's nice to see some of you virtually, see other people's names. Thanks a lot for having me. So yeah, I wanted to talk a bit about where we are in terms of the government's response to coronavirus. I also wanted to talk a bit about the other things that the government has been doing that are not specifically related to coronavirus. So what's been happening kind of under the radar. And I wanted to talk a bit about where I think that should take us. So first of all, just looking at the legal framework, obviously one of the government's first responses was a rush to legislate in response to the pandemic. So we saw the Coronavirus Act. Now, this was rushed through Parliament in one day. It was nodded through, which meant that the opposition essentially agreed not to hold it up, waylay it. And it's one of the biggest restrictions on civil liberties in at least a generation. So it allows for the borders to be closed indefinitely. It allows for police to detain people who are suspected of being infected for up to 48 hours. And it also gives powers of detention to immigration officers. It means that people can be forcibly questioned about their whereabouts, their social contacts. It means people can be forcibly tested. It means people can be compelled to quarantine with no upper time limit and no judicial involvement. But the Act also allows local authorities to lower the standard of social care that they offer to people. It lowers safeguards on mental health detention. It bans gatherings, including protests. So all of this was nodded through in a single day. And these powers have no firm end date. So there was a campaign that was led by Big Brother Watch, and lots of MPs joined and Liberty supported, to say that at the very least there should be a vote at 6 months on whether or not these powers should be reviewed. That was agreed, but all of the powers come as a package. So if we think we still need retired NHS doctors to return, but we don't need the power to close the borders, for example, MPs either have to say yes to all of it or they have to say no to all of it. The powers all come as a package, so it's not the most effective check on them. So that's what happened with the Coronavirus Act. So that's a piece of legislation that's now just sitting on the statute books, which Parliament can renew as and when it wishes. And of course, you can see the room for kind of racialized implementation of some of its provisions, specifically in relation to, you know, detention powers, questioning powers. We know that all of the charges made under the Coronavirus Act, all of them were wrong. They were issued in error. We know that the first woman to be charged under the Coronavirus Act is a Black woman, right? So we already see kind of racialized use of those powers. So that's one bit of the legal jigsaw that I wanted to talk about. The second part I wanted to talk about is the lockdown regulations. So these are powers that basically were used to give the police the power to stop people from leaving their houses or to criminalize them for leaving without a reasonable excuse. And this has been a constantly changing patchwork of rules. They've all been brought in using an emergency procedure relating to secondary legislation. So it means the powers come into force before Parliament even sees them, and Parliament then votes on them weeks after they've been in force, by which time, most of the time, they've been updated with new regulations. So it's been incredibly difficult to follow. It's been difficult for people to know what behaviour is and isn't criminalised. And there's been a real discrepancy between what was in the government's guidance, which it publicly communicated, and what was in the letter of the law. And so in that gap, you find ridiculous things like the police saying that you're not allowed to buy Easter eggs, that the Easter eggs are illegal, right? And that's a kind of funny example, except it's not funny because, again, we know that the fines issued under the coronavirus regulations have disproportionately been levied against people of colour. So again, we know that there is disproportionate implementation there. And so moving on to kind of I suppose I wanted to talk a little bit about test and trace and the NHS dashboard. And I think we might touch on this more in the discussion later. So I'll just say briefly that, you know, the government wanted its own bespoke test and trace app, and it wanted it to be centralized rather than decentralized. And essentially a decentralized app means that the contact tracing, it means that the communication kind of happens on someone's phone. So it means that the government doesn't end up with a big map of people's social contacts, and the government isn't the one that's doing the contacting of people who've been in contact with infected people. Now, the government really recently climbed down and said, fine, we'll do a decentralized app, because Apple and Google had collaborated to make a decentralized app, one that would be operable with both of their operating systems. Now, that was a good thing for privacy rights, but as people like Dr. Michael Veal have said, what does that mean about platform power? What does it mean when actually governments can't say to private corporations, we want to do our app this way, and you have to help us facilitate that? So it may have been that, you know, the corporations in this instance were doing the thing that we thought was better for rights protections, but in terms of who has power in the big picture sense, that's quite concerning. And I suppose that brings me on to the NHS dashboard, which is a project that hasn't been talked about very much. And it's difficult to find much out about. So a legal startup called Foxglove have joined up with Open Democracy to kind of do some really amazing litigation to force data sharing agreements to be made public. But I mean, in the broadest brush, what we can say is that the NHS dashboard is something that's been introduced as a kind of data analytics system for the NHS in response to COVID. It involves Google, Microsoft, Amazon, Palantir, and Palantir, you know, many of you will know, has been accused of complicity in kind of gross human rights violations, specifically in relation to the US border. So what we see is companies getting a foothold in the NHS and most likely learning things about the NHS that will make it easier to market products in the future to the NHS. And it will also make it easier for them to market things that are interoperable with other kind of public policy objectives. So when the Home Office is saying we massively want to use data more to do immigration enforcement, and Palantir is a security tech firm and most likely going to be interested in that, and they've also had a foothold and an insight into how things work in the NHS, we know that that's really concerning. So that was what I wanted to say about test and trace. We've also seen proposals around things like immunity passports, which I think we can talk more about in the break if people are interested. But I suppose the last thing I wanted to say is that obviously lots of things have continued to happen that aren't to do with COVID, but have flown under the radar. So the government continues to build for prisons. The hostile environment is still in place. Stop and search rates are rocketing. The latest counter-terror bill essentially reintroduces control orders, which means people under house arrest indefinitely without any of the benefits of a criminal trial. There's a new foreign national offenders bill, which will ostensibly overhaul the UK's asylum laws. We've got the immigration bill, which is going to subject 3 million more people to the hostile environment. We've got a domestic abuse bill that leaves out migrant women. Priti Patel is expanding Prevent to regional hubs. The government's confirmed an independent review of the Human Rights Act. And we've also seen the leak to the Sunday Times about self-ID for trans people potentially being scrapped. So I suppose I had a lot more kind of less doom and gloom things to say, but I think I can say that as we have discussion later on. But I suppose I just wanted to make really clear that obviously there are specific things around the government's response to coronavirus that have exposed people to racialized harm to which they would not otherwise have been exposed. But at the same time, the crisis is also allowing the government to continue with projects that will cause harm to racialized communities. And that isn't necessarily getting the attention that it needs. But we can talk more about what to do about that later on.
Thank you very much. Maria is for you.
Thank you, Gracie. That was fantastic. We've got lots of questions that have come in, but we'll wait till the end to discuss them. I'd now like to introduce Dr. Adam Elliott Cooper, who's a research associate in sociology at the University of Greenwich. His research focuses on geography and spatial theory, social movements and activism, anti-racism and British policing in Britain and its colonies. Some of his recent publications include an excellent article entitled "Our Life is a Struggle, Gender, Respectability and Black Resistance," and another great piece entitled "The Struggle That Cannot Be Named, Violence, Space and the Re-Articulation of Anti-Racist Racism in Coast-to-Ghana Britain." He sits on the board of the Monitoring Group, an anti-racist organisation challenging state racism and racial violence.
Okay, great. I'm unmuted, I think, right? So I just want to say a quick thank you to all of the organisers today, everyone at UEL and Birmingham and everyone else who's put this event together. I think it's really important we're having these conversations, particularly during the mass protests that have been happening recently. But of course, as Gracie mentioned, all of the other things that the government is slipping in, whether it be the criminalisation of migration or Muslim communities through the new terrorism acts or all the other horrendous violations on our liberties and rights and freedoms that this government are attempting to impose upon us. So I guess I wanted to talk a little bit more generally about the way in which policing has evolved over the last few years, but I think almost really importantly, the ways in which it's been resisted over the last few months, which I think is a really important point of the conversation as well. So as Gracie mentioned a bit already, and as I'm sure Maya will mention and others will mention in a lot more detail, racism has been fundamental to the expansion of police powers. I mean, for a very, very long time. I mean, the expansion of police powers for Britain in its colonies was justified through racism, whether it be the expansion of the kind of counterinsurgency policing that we saw in decolonising societies like those in Kenya or Malaya or Cyprus or Palestine and other places like that. But also in the post-war period, we've continually seen the expansion of police powers also being justified through racism, whether that be the spectre of the migrants or the so-called foreign national and more illicit or deviant or criminal activity coming to Britain through migration, whether it be the idea that Muslim communities are these spaces of violence and deviancy anti-Western civilization sentiments and against British values and all those other coded forms of racism, which have justified the expansion of our prisons and policing systems. Whether it be the war against drug use and drug supply, which again, the spectre of the drug dealer again conjures up these images of racialized people. But one I want to focus on, which has been used a great deal recently, has been the spectre of the gang and the idea that the gangster, or that particularly those wielding knives, have been the focus of a massive expansion of police powers and a justification of the expansion of our prison system. So in a similar way to the hostile environment policy or prevent, the war against gangs, or as David Cameron called it, he called it the war against gangs and gang culture in 2011, or the ways in which the policing of serious youth violence has been expanded, as I mentioned, in a comparable way to the hostile environment policy and prevent, has seeped into other areas of public life. So, so schools and hospitals and other public institutions have been encouraged, and the government has talked about trying to impose duties upon healthcare workers and education workers to identify not signs for being undocumented, as with the hostile environment policy, or signs of religious extremism, as with prevent, but signs of being involved in a gang, so signs of violence in that regard. But we've also seen it being expanded in other areas of public life as well. So we see government's funding for youth work and community work being geared towards this policing of gangs. But we also see the surveillance of young people being expanded through this idea of dealing with this apparent gang problem. So whether it be the monitoring of social media of young people, the monitoring of their use of YouTube, the monitoring of music videos and the kind of art and performance and culture that young people produce, all of these forms of surveillance of often Black cultural life are again being used to justify the policing of so-called gangs. And I think this is a particularly important way of understanding racism and policing, not simply because it mirrors other forms of racist policing that I've already mentioned, but also because of the way in which it's seeped into not only the policing of the coronavirus, but also the policing of the recent protests. So as Gracie mentioned, we've seen a massive increase in stop and searches for drugs and weapons during the COVID lockdown. This is as we usually see with these kinds of initiatives when it comes to the so-called policing of gangs or so-called knife crime. The impetus or the excuse for increasing levels of stop and search, things like Section 60, are often to reduce levels of violence. But not only do they have zero or negligible effects on reducing levels of violence, but overwhelmingly, anyone who is stopped and searched and eventually apprehended or arrested is almost always caught with drugs on them, generally a small amount of cannabis. So we see the ways in which the excuse for expanding these kinds of police powers doesn't even fit within the logic of the police and prison system themselves, but they still produce these kinds of racist outcomes. But the other thing we've seen happening is we've seen the police using the policing of gangs to try to repress the protests that we've seen recently. Right? So we've seen the largest anti-racist protests in British history over the last few weeks. We've seen almost over 100,000 people take to the streets, not just in large multicultural cities across England, but also in smaller, more rural areas, towns and villages in Wales and parts of rural England and Scotland as well. And I think that demonstrates the frustration and the anger, not just with the killing of George Floyd or even the state of policing in this country, but also I think the nationalism and patriotism that has brought racism to the fore in recent years with the referendum results and the rise of the Boris Johnson's administration. And so through the policing of gangs and the surveillance that the police have in place, we've seen the ways in which the police have been able to prevent people from even attending these protests. So certain people who are on the police's gangs matrix where they identify people as being involved in a so-called gang, not necessarily based upon prior offences or arrests or any other information like that, but so-called police intelligence, which is very opaque, and as Amnesty International and other institutions have identified, is grossly out of step with any of the evidence of these young people becoming affected by violence or harm in any kind of way. And importantly, black people are hugely overrepresented within these databases as well. So what the police have been able to do is identify young people from these that they've put onto these databases and go onto their social media accounts and say, oh, I've seen that you've put something about Black Lives Matter on your social media accounts. We're going to send you a message to let you know that you're not allowed to go to these protests, because we will interpret your attendance at these protests as an intention to engage in violence, and therefore it will break the terms of whether it be a gang injunction or a different type of injunction, or their bail conditions if they're formally incarcerated or arrested or anything like that. And so we've seen the ways in which these forms of surveillance have extended, not simply to not just in the areas of public life that happened before the corona lockdown, but also people's freedom to engage in protest and unironically protest against policing and police racism. But I think one of the most important things and one of the most exciting things that's come out of the recent protests isn't simply all of the depressing things that we've mentioned before, but the ways in which people are articulating a new form of resistance to the police and prison system. Right? People are articulating the fact that while the prison population in Britain has almost doubled over the last 30 or 40 years, police have been given a whole swathe of new powers that they've never had before. We haven't seen any improvements in public safety. We haven't seen significant reductions in the violence and harm that people experience in their lives. And the argument, therefore, has been levelled that the police are beyond reform, and that the police and prison system should not be relied upon to deal with the social problems that exist within society. And so by identifying the fact that people within our ever-expanding prison system are far more likely to experience domestic violence or child abuse, suffer with have to deal with special educational needs, have experienced mental health problems in the past, have experienced school exclusion or homelessness or precarious employment, all of these kinds of social problems that are being dealt with by the police or prison system, being locked away in our ever-expanding prisons, should actually be dealt with through social programs, through educational programs, through health programs, through educational initiatives, by ending tuition fees or bringing back the educational maintenance allowance, by building better council housing that's secure, by providing better social care and health care, by all of these types of things that can prevent people from having to come into contact with the criminal justice system in the first place, and therefore eroding the power and resources and the government's reliance on the police and prison system to deal with social problems, is the best kind of criminal justice reform we can hope for. The best kind of criminal justice is to have less criminal justice, and having more social policies, more educational initiatives, more health and social care is the best way in which we can live in a less harmful, less violent, safer society that doesn't rely on racist criminalisation and surveillance in order to attempt or ameliorate the social problems that the inequality and injustice of our current political system continues to reproduce. I'll leave it there.
Thank you, Adam. Thank you. That was fantastic. Again, lots of questions coming in. I'd now like to move on to our next speaker, Dr. Maya Goodfellow, who's a writer, academic, and broadcast commentator. She has written for a range of publications, including the New York Times and Guardian. Mary is author of the excellent book, Hostile Environments, How Immigrants Become Scapegoats, published by Verso recently, 2019. She holds a PhD from SOAS, University of London, where she examined race and processes of racialization in British international development discourse. She's a trustee of the Rigmond Trust, an independent race equality think tank.
Hi, thank you very much for that, and thank you for having me here. I'm going to try to not replicate anything that's been said, but maybe touch upon or go into a bit more depth about some of the stuff that Gracie mentioned towards the end of her speech, which was thinking about the hostile environment and I guess ongoing forms of immigration enforcement during the global pandemic that we're still living through. And so what I'm going to do is try to think about what the impact of that immigration enforcement has continued to be during this moment of crisis, but also this moment in which we've sort of been told that we're all in it together. And whilst I assume quite a lot of people who are listening realize that to be false in all the ways that coronavirus has sort of shone a light on existing inequalities in the UK, I think immigration enforcement is something that risks being overlooked in terms of the extent of the damage done and the things that government knew they could do but have chosen to not do or not pause in this moment. And then I'm going to think a bit about the discourse around this, and I'll try to maybe say some slightly hopeful things about where we go from here. But just as a sort of, before I start, when I'm talking about the hostile environment, I'm talking specifically about the set of immigration policies that were broadly brought in through the 2014 and 2016 Immigration Acts. But when I use that term, I don't use it meaning that the UK wasn't a hostile environment for immigrants prior to this period. So the hostile environment has much longer, history that I don't have time to go into. When I'm talking about here, I'm largely thinking about those policies that were brought in through those immigration acts. And I think one of the reasons why it's worth talking about this in this moment, as well as understanding the impact of ongoing immigration enforcement and really understanding how wedded government are to a lot of their immigration policy, I think as well is when we're hearing these necessary calls to defund the police, and we're thinking about what policies will look like in terms of defunding the police. I think we also need to talk about our immigration enforcement and our bordering processes, because often borders are sort of treated as necessary to keep people safe, but actually the forms of violence that are produced through borders, I mean, we all know are so incredibly harmful. They predispose people to death, vulnerability, and make people's lives incredibly difficult. And this is deeply racialized when we're talking about immigration enforcement and bordering. And the reason why I say this in particular is because if we look at deaths of state violence in the UK, we also see the names of people like Jimmy Mubenga and Joy Gardner. And you know, if we're going to talk about the fact that the UK is not innocent, the UK has its own problems with systemic racism, it's really striking. It's very difficult to argue otherwise when you look at the fact that one of the things that reportedly Jimmy Mubenga said before he was killed by G4S guards on a plane where he was being deported was the words "I can't breathe," which, you know, quite clearly have become so painfully symbolic, and it's so deeply connected to the murder of George Floyd. I think it's really worth drawing those parallels to understand, as well as the differences, the similarities between these different things we're talking about. And just as I think a useful definition for thinking about what I'm going to be talking about in terms of the immigration enforcement, I think going into this, a really helpful definition for understanding racism generally, but in this particular moment, is Ruth Wilson Gilmore's understanding of racism. And she describes racism as the state-sanctioned or extra-legal production and exploitation of group-differentiated vulnerability to premature death. And I think in this moment of coronavirus, when we are seeing the impacts of systemic racism in terms of the differential outcomes, we know that Pakistani, Bangladeshi, and Black Britons are far more likely to be impacted and die from coronavirus. We can really see this vulnerability to premature death. We can see what is meant by this definition of racism. And I think we can see that in immigration enforcement too. And so I spent the past few months talking to people who are trying to navigate the immigration system and talking to people who work in the system in terms of people who work in migrant rights organizations who are doing some of that really, really necessary work, trying to help people navigate the immigration system. And there's two ways that you can really see immigration enforcement, the impacts of it continuing to manifest, which I think is sort of they're overlapping, but they are slightly different. One is access to healthcare, which right now, when we're told that is the most important thing, is something that people are still struggling to access. And the other is access to forms of state support in terms of financial support. And so just very quickly, the hostile environment is pretty much in place in its entirety right now. Even though we've been living in like lockdown Britain, where a lot of things have been introduced, although piecemeal from government, the hostile environment is broadly still in place. And this is despite organizations like Liberty, JCWI, right at the start of the pandemic, before the lockdown even started, drawing up a list of things government could do to support migrants, to ensure that everyone could access healthcare, and the government chose not to do that. They've been repeatedly presented with this information and evidence, and they've chosen not to act. Or they've chosen to act in a way that allows the hostile environment to continue to be enforced. And what that means for people who are undocumented, but people depending on their immigration status, is that they are, a lot of people are scared to go to their GP, scared to go to their local hospital. Doctors of the world have done work around this, looking at how people are more vulnerable, and there's an issue around the hostile environment has already deterred a lot of people from seeking access to healthcare, because that's one of the things that the hostile environment does. It deters you from seeking basic services, like going to your local GP or like going to your hospital. And so for some people, they've already developed underlying health conditions because of the hostile environment over the past 10 years, and that means they're more predisposed to coronavirus. But for others, including those people, they're just worried. Even if they develop symptoms, they're worried about going to seek healthcare because they're worried that their data will be shared with the Home Office, they're worried that they will be charged. And one of the things that the government has refused to do is set up a firewall between the NHS and the Home Office or other government departments, which has been done in Ireland and would mean that people had some kind of confidence that they could go and seek that healthcare and wouldn't have their information at some point handed over, that wouldn't at some point come back to get them. And one of the concerns is people are worried they're going to be detained, they're worried they're going to be deported, or they're worried that it's going to impact further immigration applications. If they're trying to change status later down the line, this will somehow impact them. And there are quite easy solutions to this. You can, as has been done in Portugal to some degree, give all migrants, including people who are undocumented, including people who are waiting on their asylum application, the rights of citizens. In this moment, you could give people like full rights so that everyone is able to access the same services, which should, in my opinion, be the case in normal times anyway. But in this moment of supposed crisis, that's something you could do, but the government have chosen not to do. And what they have done instead is, although there have been some shifts in terms of they put coronavirus in an exempt diseases list. So if you go to a hospital and you are going to be tested for coronavirus and then you test positive, you should not be charged for that. But after 10 years of people being told to be scared of going to their local GP, it's not simply enough to sort of say that on your website, on the government website, and then not have some kind of major publicity campaign around it. And so the government that is so adept at creating hostile messages had vans drive around parts of the UK reading Go Home, had a whole package of policies that it proudly called the hostile environment. A government that is able to come up with slogans, it has just been unwilling to communicate any of the small changes clearly in any kind of way at all. But what they have done for the hostile environment is they've changed the guidance, at least during lockdown, so that some of the policies are just, they're still enforceable. So landlords will issue new guidance so that they didn't have to get people's original documentation, but could have photocopied documentation just so they could continue to check people's documentation before they do any kind of renting. And so that shows us that they are thinking about it. They're just thinking about how they can ensure that the hostile environment policies are still enforced. And I mean, I guess none of this is particularly surprising, but it is sort of worth reflecting on this, given a lot of the rhetoric that's come out of government and given the sort of concern about people being able to access healthcare. It really shows how wedded the government are to their immigration policies, that they're literally willing to undermine public health in order to maintain parts of their immigration enforcement. I don't think that's the argument that we should be making. People should be able to access healthcare because they should be able to access healthcare, but it is worth reflecting on the fact that that is where they're at in terms of their unwillingness to let go of some of these policies. And very, very quickly, the other part that I mentioned is thinking about state support. There's so much I could say about this. There's so many things that people haven't been given because of their immigration status, or because they're undocumented, or because they are living in asylum accommodation and are given such a small amount of money. But I guess the main thing really to understand is people are still being made destitute. They're still being given very little, almost no, in some cases no support at all, simply because of their immigration status. And possibly one of the most obvious examples of that, I think, is no recourse to public funds, which I'm sure you've all sort of seen, being reported on during the pandemic. And I think this just really shows us as how little support there is in normal times there are for people who are undocumented. and people, depending on their immigration status, if they have no recourse to public funds attached to that, their immigration status. But I just really quickly wanted to end, I suppose, on thinking about the discourse around this. And there's been a lot of, so I said I'd be positive, but this is actually not going to be positive here. There's been a lot of positivity around the fact that there's been this shift. Key workers who were being called low skilled a few months ago are now being seen as not low skilled, are now being seen as key workers, essential to keeping the UK going, if you like. And I think there's two problems with this. One is, what about everyone who isn't a key worker? Like, are we saying that we should divvy up people's rights depending on what their job is? And if you're a key worker, like, I think one of the worst examples of this, and there's quite a lot of people who were so happy about this, and I felt as like maybe I'm just really pessimistic and unkind, but when Piers Morgan was talking about the fact that, oh, there are lots of people who come from the Philippines who work in the NHS, and maybe that should change the immigration debate because they're saving our lives. And you really think, okay, so people have to save your life in order for you to see them as a human being and think that they're deserving of rights. There's a major problem with that argument. There's a major, major problem. And the reason why it's a major problem is not just because, oh, rhetoric matters and this is like the good migrant, the bad migrant. It's because it then literally shapes policy. So if you look at the immigration health surcharge, that has been stopped for people who are healthcare workers and care workers. Although not everyone in the NHS, a lot of people in the NHS still have to pay that. But what about everyone else? Everyone else who has that applied to them simply because they're an immigrant. That is the rule. You pay in already through your taxes and your national insurance, like people who are British citizens. All of the immigrants are still going to be paying that immigration health surcharge. And I think it's really worth reflecting on the sort of the scale of the outrage that there was, including from the Labour Party, and that, you know, figures from across the political spectrum were really outraged that doctors and nurses were having to pay for twice over for the health service they work in. And the argument should be no one should have to pay twice over for a basic service, something that everyone should have access to, which is healthcare all the time, but not least in this moment of global pandemic. And so I guess that, I don't know if this is a positive thing that I'm ending on, but I guess the thing that I want to really press home is that it's rights for everyone, not just rights for a few, depending on what their status is, what their job is, if they're deemed to be good enough. And the reason I say that is that the government has, for quite a long time, and will continue to do so, has been talking about control. They talk about the Australian points-based system, which it isn't at all. We can maybe talk about that, the Q&A. But control is actually not just about stopping people from coming. It's about deciding the rights that they can access when they do come. And so if we're thinking about rights and we're thinking about really changing the way that people are treated in the UK, it's not just about the key workers, it's about everyone regardless of their immigration status, and that means people who are undocumented too. And so I think that this needs to be at the center of any kind of calls for change, is that we should be focusing on the damages done by bordering processes and not getting caught up in this sort of dividing people up into the worthy and the unworthy, because we're already there, we're already in that's already been done for decades. And I think real change is really going to have to come from undoing this idea of the problem immigrant at all, and that has to mean everyone, no matter what their status. But I'll end there. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Maya. Let me just change it. Okay. So at the moment, we don't know if Saskia Sassen is actually attending the meeting. So there is no one with the name Saskia Sassen among the participants, but she could be. So in case she's there, hopefully she can raise the hands or doing some sign. In the meantime, I'd like to, before we open maybe the floor for questions that Baria and Rachel on YouTube have been collecting, me and Baria were going to make a couple of points on that maybe can also help the conversation. In particular, I think it's really important, and this is something that has been raised also recently, is to think of the fact that the extent to which for a long time the campaigning for migrant rights on one end and the anti-racist movement has sort of walked on parallel roads, up to the point also to have open conflict between the activists and advocates on both sides in some circumstances. And I think one of the things we are trying to do today was very much to bring both angles into the conversation. So to think about both the impact of racialized policing on migrants and citizens at the same time, and think about, and this is why it's very important, the point that we made around, on one end, the racialized policing, on the other end, also the immigration enforcement as a form of racializing policing. So it would be interesting to hear more about how can we sort of find ways of working across these two different agendas in more explicit ways. Is one aspect that I want to trace. And I don't know, and the other point is about the key workers, which I found quite interesting, because the key workers, the positive narrative on migration. Recently, we saw Portes has been writing about it, about the change in the public attitude. It's interesting how it's not what we are seeing in other countries. I mean, in US, we have, the closing the borders, the migrants bring the disease, but also in many other countries where you don't have the same kind of participation in the NHS of migrants or migrant origin people, you don't really have the kind of discourse on the key workers, for example. So it will be quite interesting if there is something specific about the UK and the migration history of UK, or the history of different diversity in UK, that also is challenge some of the sort of more xenophobic narratives.
Thank you. Yeah, I just wanted to come back on this specific point around how do we work across silos, and how do we stop anti-racism and migrants' rights being in two completely different spaces. I mean, I think one thing is that insistence on a definition of racism that is explicitly structural. So what Maya said in terms of, vulnerability to premature death, because I think we're often still talking about racism, for some people it's literally funny tinge, for other people it is, whether or not you're allowed in and out of the country, right? So we don't have shared understandings of what racism is. And I think, there are lots of us who have kind of, it's just very much, we understand, there's the racism that discriminates and the racism that kills, like Sivanandan says, but other people, that's not something that people have thought about at all, right? So you might get to a point where anti-racism in the migrant sector, was literally like, let's have more non-white people staff, So I think there has to be something that means that we have a common and shared understanding of of structural racism. And I think we also probably, I think liberty is fortunate in that we work across all civil liberties issues, right? So I'm able to sit and look at what's happening in counter-terror, what's happening in surveillance, what's happening in policing, and it's really easy to see, oh right, the structure of the state's behavior is very similar across these areas, and how it treats race, it's easy to see that because that's the perspective from which I work, and I'm working at the policy level. When it comes to we have to think about how the migrant NGO sector, for example, is funded or not funded, right? When you're providing services and you don't have enough money to really pay your staff much of a living wage, there are people who, like me, are structurally excluded from working at, a very low pay for a very long time. There are people who can't do that, so you miss out on the analysis there. But it also just means you never have any time. I spent a long time working, at small organizations with torture survivors, and you're just firefighting, right? So I think there's also something quite structural about the way the sector is funded that means that people don't get the breathing space. It also means that the organizations maybe who do get a bit more breathing space are the ones who are, may have a narrower mandate, so who are working specifically on refugees rather than refugees and migrants more broadly. So I think it's a good question to put to funders. I think it's a good question to put to quite senior people in the sector, because I think a lot of it is structural.
Can you hear me? Yeah, I'm unmuted. Yeah, I agree with all of that, and I was just going to add, I guess, sort of bringing those two questions that you sort of posed together. I could have been pessimistic again, I'm sorry. But like the thing about public attitudes is, I don't think it doesn't matter at all, but I suppose I'm like sort of less interested in it as a way of like sort of measuring where things are on immigration, because I think the government is going to continue to legislate and say it's what people want. They're still pushing ahead with ending free movement, and then they're likely going to bring in an even more aggressive immigration system, with basically no scrutiny. And I also kind of, you know, with polling and public opinion, like, not to hate on this as a part of like academia and social science, but like the way it's done, it's like the questions that are asked and how they're asked, it's like it's a snapshot, right? And so yes, there's something positive to take from that, in that what it shows is that people's views on immigration are not static, they are changeable. And what we've been told for decades is that you must reduce immigration for good race relations. And so this is sort of where the bringing the two together, I think, is really clear. Is if we look back at the history, what we see is the history of immigration legislation is a history of racism, right? And so we saw that with Windrush, we saw that with the Windrush scandal, how these things are interconnected, inseparable from one another. And I would agree with what Gracie said in terms of these different understandings of what racism is. But I do think something that I was going to say, but I thought I'd maybe gone on a bit too long, is that this discourse around criminality is really, really central, particularly right now, for the government defending its immigration system. So if you look at what they've said about people who have continued to be detained, they released a load of people from detention after organisations like Detention Action and others have lobbied consistently for people to be released, and they did because because of the huge health risks of keeping people detained, but also all the stuff we know about people being detained and it being so unnecessary. I mean, it's unnecessary anyway. Obviously, we should be advocating for the end to detention altogether. But it's interesting that the justification for it is that these people are foreign national offenders and they are dangerous and pose a risk to the public. And I've interviewed quite a lot of people who have gone from prison and then been taken straight to a detention centre. And so there is this quite clear connection. I think we can, it is, I'm sure, drawn out by people, but could be drawn out more in terms of how the racist arms of the state work in conjunction with one another. Policing and detention are not these two separate things, right? And so I think that it's worth understanding that and trying to unpick that further. But that's also why I'm not totally optimistic about the public opinion stuff, is because some of those fundamental ideas, some of those fundamentally racist ideas about immigration that have been built up over decades in the UK, they have not disappeared altogether. And even if we look at some of the defences of immigration that continue to be made, they do not dispel the racist myths about immigration being a threat to British culture. And yes, there is some shifts in terms of how the public understand culture and the economics of immigration, but the fundamental arguments that have been made for decades haven't been challenged. Like, they've been challenged by campaign groups and by people advocating for their own rights, but not at like a national level. And so maybe I'm just totally wrong, and I'd be happy to be really wrong about this, but I'm sort of skeptical about that, about what the public opinion really means when you drill down to it, and then what it means in terms of policy. We just haven't seen the shifts. We just haven't seen the government shift in the way that I think we would need to, for that to be as positive as we might like.
Thank you very much, Maya. Bahia?
Okay, lovely. So I've got, there's so many questions here, but I think maybe it's a good idea, Adam, there's quite a few here that's that have been asked to you, and I've just gathered them all together, and this particular one is really good, and the question is, can you speak to the way in which the materiality of surveillance or counter-surveillance, so devices, technologies themselves, as example, body-worn cams and camera phones, so the ways in which the materiality of these surveillances have impacted these already racialized relations between police and protester?
So of course, body-worn cameras have been, I guess, in a slightly pragmatic way, utilised by a lot of protesters. We perhaps in some of the more high-profile ones we recently saw, an elderly gentleman in Tottenham being tasered by the police in his own home until he fell down the stairs, and that was, and there was a big campaign kind of centering around that. And there have been instances where body cam footage has been retrieved from the police and has been used as a galvanizing tool. However, I would still err on the side of caution as to whether the police wearing body cameras is an effective way of reducing police violence or police racism. There have been lots of far more longitudinal studies in the United States which have found that body-worn cameras have no significant effects in reducing levels of harm, reducing levels of violence, reducing levels of racism or profiling or anything like that. More often than not, the police turn off their cameras at key moments, turn on their cameras at key moments, so that you only get half the story, which can often be more damaging than having no footage at all. Very often we also see the fact that these body-worn cameras are creating the impression of accountability, creating the impression of transparency, creating the impression that they're going to affect meaningful change. And I think this illusion of progress can also be quite damaging. And also, really importantly, they're another surveillance tool. Right? They're a walking surveillance tool. We're already one of the most surveilled countries in the entire world here in the United Kingdom. And this will be another tool which won't be pointed at police officers. It's going to be pointed at members of the public most of the time. And I think that we have to remember that, I think on balance, despite the fact that I will acknowledge there are a handful of cases in which body-worn cameras have been useful for activists in identifying specific cases, I think overall we need to take away these kinds of surveillance technologies and I think we need to think about them in the same way that we think about CCTV more generally. Yes, occasionally CCTV has been more effective for specific cases, but I think we need to make sure that we understand them as a tool of surveillance. But I think equally as importantly, citizens surveilling the state is something that's super effective. And I think that people being more empowered to video the police, to video their interactions, to video instances of violence has been a really, really powerful galvanizing tool. Not simply for dissuading or being used as a form of resistance in the moment in itself, but also being a galvanizing tool for identifying and showing the ways in which police violence is a material reality, as the question asked, as the question posed, right? And I think it's that kind of almost visceral reaction that people have to seeing, not simply hearing the story of a man who is effectively tortured to death over nearly 9 minutes in the middle of the street, but having to sit through that I think makes it such a powerful tool in showing the human dimension to this system of violence and control.
In terms of how fast do you see surveillance changing policy, which I think is a really good question. So is it already adding to the arsenal of the hostile environment that you've pointed towards, Mayor, or the campaigning element?
So there have been bulk data sharing schemes between the Home Office and other government departments for some time. So I think specifically in relation to driving licenses, for example, that bulk data sharing has gone on for a while. What we see with the hostile environment is, Maya talks about the legislation that's come in terms of the 2014 and the 2016 Immigration Act. But what you also see with the hostile environment is the establishment of multiple bulk data sharing agreements between the Home Office and other government departments. And those agreements either function to enable data sharing that would allow an essential service provider to determine that a person is not entitled to access that good or service, but they also function the other way insofar as when someone does access an essential good or service or attempts to, their information is then given to the Home Office so that the Home Office can more easily detain or deport them. So we see, so if you have a look on the Liberty website, there's a report called Care Don't Share, which essentially details all of these bulk data sharing agreements. And as I say, some of it had been going on for some time, but a lot of it was new. So for example, children's school records being transferred on a monthly basis from the Department for Education to the Home Office for immigration enforcement purposes. NHS records similarly. I think this is something I wanted to come back to actually, Maya, in terms of, often we think a lot about the government in terms of immigration enforcement, but one of the things about the hostile environment is that it involves so many other departments that you have a more effective counterweight to Home Office power than you would if it was just the Home Office doing something. So that's why we've seen, for example, the Department for Education bow to public pressure around use of children's nationality and country of birth. It's why we saw NHS Digital back out of one data sharing scheme with the Home Office. So I think it's important to say that kind of the more collaboration there is and the more it spreads, the stronger there is a counterweight to the Home Office, insofar as it is not everybody's job in government to do immigration enforcement. That is one public policy objective among lots of others. But I guess just also to say that at the end of the Care Don't Share report, we also think about things like facial recognition, for example, given that the Home Office, when people come in to the country, if they come in on some kind of visa rather than coming in totally clandestinely, they will have a biometric residence permit. The Home Office will have a record of people's faces, right? So when we think about facial recognition as a tool for immigration enforcement, we see that there's massive scope there potentially. The government hasn't said that it will use it to those ends, but you can see that. You can see things like social media analysis, so using AI to map people's networks to see who knows who. That again would make immigration enforcement far more efficient. So I suppose the kind of the data sharing schemes and the Home Office's aspiration to essentially build a massive hostile environment database, that's the policy change that we're seeing now in terms of immigration enforcement looking different to how it did 10 years ago. I think we're moving towards a place, and I think this is why a lot of these struggles are really, really urgent, more so than ever, is that we're moving towards a place where immigration enforcement can be far, far more efficient on the government's terms than it currently is, because these are going to be big data sets that are mapped at kind of the click of a button, and it will just be computer says, no, you can't go to the doctor, no, you can't rent a house. That's the world that we're heading towards. So I think new technologies aren't necessarily changing the logic of state interventions in immigration enforcement, but they're absolutely going to change the scale and the speed and the efficiency of those interventions.
Maybe because there's quite a lot of questions on historical roots. So there's an interest and quite a lot of questions. And Adam, you pointed towards a colonial encounter, the hostile environment in terms of the historical legacies behind that as well. The question is can you comment a little bit more on the historical roots of the current situation?
Okay, I'm free from you, I think.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, I think empire is fundamentally important for us to understand policing and borders and state power generally. I mean, I could talk about it all night, so I'm not going to do that. But what I will say, as briefly as possible, is that most of British policing hasn't taken place on the British mainland. It's taken place on Britain's colonies, in the Caribbean, other parts of the Americas, the African continents, the Indian subcontinent, Australia, other parts of Hong Kong, importantly, Ireland, and this policing was, I guess, what called paramilitary policing. So the military and the police were almost indistinguishable, and so the kind of policing that you can imagine in the colonies was not the kind of PR policing of community policing by consent, and all of the other overtures that the British government like to tell themselves and each other. And we begin to see this kind of more paramilitary policing migrate to the British mainland, probably in the post-war period, and it comes through two different colonies. The one colony that's British colonial policing or paramilitary policing comes to the British mainland is through Ireland. So we see the kinds of techniques and technologies of paramilitary policing being used in Northern Ireland, whether it be mass arrests, mass imprisonments, the use of kind of the technology we associate with riot police, so things like rubber bullets, CS spray, and the armour that they use, different kinds of surveillance technologies, all of those types of things that have been used in the colonies, particularly, as I mentioned, Kenya, Malaya, Palestine, Cyprus, Oman, Rhodesia, etc., were being used in Northern Ireland. And the other place where we see that those kind of technologies come in are via Hong Kong. And so in the 1980s, following the uprisings in Brixton, Toxteth, St Paul's, Chapeltown, and other places, other multicultural urban areas of Britain, we see the colonial police from Northern Ireland and Hong Kong come to the British mainland to teach British police how to use their kind of colonial tactics, technologies and weapons. So we see SSAHE being used on the British mainland for the first time in Toxteth in 81. We see and then in Moss Side a few months later, we see the kind of riot police with the armour and all of that kind of stuff being used, and also, as well as the technologies, the use of mass arrests and all of those types of things. And so we see the kinds of colonial policing migrating back to the British mainland, almost as we see people from Britain's colonies, former colonies, migrate to the British mainland in significant numbers in the post-war period as well. And so there's this kind of coming home of colonial policing, as we've seen the coming home to the motherland of Britain's colonial and post-colonial migrants. Very positive history.
Lovely, thank you, Ma. Yeah.
Yeah, I guess there's also, without making it too basic, I guess, is the roots of the UK's immigration policy. So what we've had is decades of really bad policy piled on top of bad policy, and you have to go back and look at those different pieces of immigration legislation to really understand how racism is sort of central to this. And so the really obvious point is that race, as we sort of now know it, was formalized, systematized, and sort of popularized, if you like, through empire. So we know, right, that the racial hierarchy that was created during that time is still with us, although it shifted in certain ways. And what we see is that very racial hierarchy shaping how immigration is understood in the 50s, 60s, 70s, and before that, but in particular those years. And so anyone who sort of paid any attention to the so-called Windrush scandal, what you'll see is that people who were coming from the colonies and former colonies came as citizens or subjects, right? So people weren't coming as immigrants, and that isn't to say that the term immigrant should be a dirty word, as it is treated as such now. It's sort of stigmatizing term, but it's to totally re-understand and reformulate what immigration is in the UK and what that movement is. And so people who were coming from the colonies and former colonies were sort of turned into immigrants, if you like, when once they were here. And one of the things that Gaminda Bambra, who has worked on this, says is she says that the immigration policies that were introduced in the 60s, 70s and 80s and since are not policies of immigration, but they're policies of racialization. So they're turning the people who were citizens and subjects into immigrants. And the reason that this was done is because certain people were seen as undesirable because of their race. And so what you see if you look at the Immigration Act, the justification, as it is now, the justification then was that you can't have too many people of a certain kind coming into the UK because it will undermine the British economy and it will fundamentally change whatever the British character and the British culture is. Like, define that, go ahead and define that for me if you want. But the interesting thing is that even the numbers of people who were coming from the colonies and former colonies weren't the thing, because there were more, for almost all the years that this was talked about in the lead up to the first Act in 62, there were more people coming from Ireland. And so if we're thinking about numbers, actually, it's obviously deeply problematic anyway. But what this shows us is that it's quite clearly about race, and it's agreed in all the academic literature. It's agreed by people who were making some of the legislation at the time, that this was about making it more difficult for people of colour to come from former colonies, and not for people to come from these colonies that were seen as the white colonies. And so at its heart, the history of immigration legislation is a history of racism, and that allows us to understand contemporary immigration legislation and contemporary ways that immigration is constructed. It allows us to understand that much better. I think that history has to be known in order to understand where we are now.
Okay, maybe it's just, this is like just a basic one, but a nice one for us to end with, which is a question again from the YouTube, in terms of the definition of racism, your definitions of racism. within the framework of your own studies and research. Linda? And maybe we could just add as well, so sorry, I know we said one, but I think this question, I really like this one. Well, they're all great. How could the academic community contribute to a call for change, a call of change? So thinking of academic and activists. So we've got two interrelated nice ones there, and end with the academic activists.
I think often when I talk about what racism or what racism is, I spend more time saying what it isn't, because there are so many bad interpretations of what racism is. But I think one of the things that's really important, I think, is that racism emerges in a historical moment in which it's necessary because Europe discovers the Americas and begins the transatlantic slave trade. And what it realizes that it needs a form of technology, a form of control, a form of governance in order to categorize different people, in order to better control them, as well as kind of philosophically justify what it is that they're doing to them. So, and I think this is important because people think that like white people just hated black people, and then after they started hating black people, then they went and did the whole slavery thing. No, it's the other way around. Like colonization was extremely profitable. It reproduced huge amounts of power, and then the technology of racism emerges through the expansion of capitalism, through imperialism, and then begins to take on a life of its own, right? Beyond the profit motive, right? Of course, right? So I'm not some kind of economic. I'm not going to, reduce everything to technology, right? It doesn't make sense that Americans then started building separate water fountains and separate toilets for black people, right? There's no economic motive in there, right? Racism takes on a life of its own, but it emerges in a moment in which it's fundamentally linked to the emergence of capitalism, right? And I think it's really important we understand that if we are going to do anti-racist work, because therefore our anti-racist work has to be an anti-capitalist work, right? It has to understand that racism is international and fundamentally linked to capitalism, because capitalism needs to, one, categorize different workers or non-workers differently in order to undervalue them. But it also needs to categorize different people differently in order to better control them, right? In order to better police them, in order to better exploit them, and sometimes in order to better harm and kill them. And I think that's, in a very long academic way, is how I would seek to go about defining racism.
Do you want to answer part two as well? So the less academic. So what can the academic do to?
What can academics do? Oh yeah, be less academic probably.
Yeah, maybe less jargon.
Yeah, get out of the library, mate. Like, I mean, yeah, academics can do lots of things, I think, to work with social movements, and I think one of them, of course, is about making our research relevant and useful, but also it's about realizing that the university is like material space that has lots of resources that we should like appropriate and try to transport into social movements and community organizations, whether it be the physical buildings that we're currently not allowed in, but hopefully we'll be back into one day, or whether it be the IT technologies and communications infrastructure that universities have that we can try to exploit and use. All of these other, physical as well as intellectual things that the university gives us access to, are the things that are really useful for community organizations and campaign groups and social movements. And I think it's understanding that there are multiple resources that aren't just the ideas in your head that can be useful for community organizations. I think there's other more practical things too.
Lovely, thanks, Adam.
Mario Griffey, have you got any final word of wisdom?
I'm not sure if Mara and Gracie would like to comment on the question.
I will, because I have to leave in like 1 minute, unfortunately.
Yeah.
I think Maya and I have already touched on a couple of definitions. So we've got Ruthie Wilson-Gilmore talking about group differentiated vulnerability to premature death. I mean, I think that's a really helpful definition. And as I said earlier, kind of Sivanandan talking about the racism that discriminates and the racism that kills. And I suppose there's a lot in kind of what Adam says about race as a technology of power, insofar as obviously, Liberty is a very broad organization with a general kind of human rights, civil liberties mandate. But a lot of what I spend time trying to do in my work is kind of explaining to people who don't think they care about racism, kind of why racist state practices and why, you know, racist structures are ultimately going to come for them too, because race is a technology of power. So when you think about something like the hostile environment, it's not confined to immigrants, because it's essentially allowing for biometric identity checks on everybody when they do something really mundane, like, you know, try and rent a property, for example. So I think it's important to kind of maintain that sort of nexus between race and power, rather than this kind of, what is it Fanon said, you know, a mental quirk, a psychological flaw. You know, that's not what we're dealing with, and that takes us down a very, very unhelpful road if that's where we stay. And I suppose just finally on that question of what can academics do, I have to say it, but I mean, obviously Join Liberty, we are a membership organisation, 10,500 people. Our members set our policy at the annual AGM. Our policy council that meets 3 times a year is drawn from the membership. Our board is drawn from the membership. So if ever you're looking at us and thinking, well, I think Liberty could be doing X, Y, or Z, that is the way to get us to do it. Please don't just email me, but that's the way to get us to do it. So I would say Join Liberty, but I mean, I agree with Adam. It's just fab to get out of the library, and also maybe think about doing some of the, what people might think of as more mundane tasks that sustain social movements. You know, people need websites building, meetings need food if we ever get to meet in person again, people need space to meet in. You know, you may be able to offer all of those things in addition to kind of your amazing academic work. So so yeah, but I have to leave, so thanks a lot for having me, and take care. Bye.
Oh, cool.
Thank you very much. Maya, do you want to do?
Yeah, I think such comprehensive definitions of racism. I feel like I don't have that much to add, but I do think it is worth sort of restating. I mean, I'm going to restate it worse than what has already been said, but something that I hear a lot, like in particular on the left actually, is this idea that like racists are knuckle dragging thugs who like go around like, you know, are basically gangs of white fascists who are all low educated and blah, blah, blah. And like, obviously it's true that fascism is a very real threat. We've seen protests in London. It's not to downplay that, but I think that the one of the things that risks being lost in Ruth Wilson Gilmore's definition is state sanctioned. Like these things are enacted, they're often perfectly legal. And so when we're thinking about this, we're not just thinking about working class people. This is throughout society. And so one of my frustrations with it, how it's talked about on the left, but also how it's talked about in parts of academia, is it's like broken down as if it's something to do with education and lack of understanding, when actually the history of racism tells us something very, very different. And we should be thinking about the ways in which it can be perfectly legal. And so I would just end, I guess, on thinking about the academic community. I'd agree with everything that's been said. I would also say, I mean, maybe it's not an issue for people who are here, but reflect on what some of the practices within the academy are. Like, think about the forms of immigration enforcement that go on, resist those. Think about whether you have cops on campus. Think about how some of your students are being treated, how you are treating some of your students. Like, this isn't all about individual level stuff, no, but it is also about how you're engaging with the structures, the resistance that goes on or not. And if we're thinking about resources as well as, again, I hate to talk about the individual level because I'm usually all about the structural. I agree with what Adam said about using the university's resources, but for those of you who maybe aren't precariously employed, maybe you're on decent salaries, throw some money to some of those migrant rights organizations that we've been talking about in your local area, those organizations that are struggling, that are doing the work, that will continue to support migrants as the government continues to roll back rights. If you have time, you know what, make the time to go to those spaces and volunteer and spend your time engaging with some of that. Like the work that is to be done is, as well as the booking rooms, as well as the food, it's also literally just being in those spaces and being able to provide that support on the basis of solidarity, not charity. I think is something that everyone should try to make the space if you can to do. I know that's not possible for everyone, but if you have I mean, I don't know if it's a luxury at the moment, but of the secure job, then I think it's worth doing.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Just a couple of final words from me, Bahia, please.
Yeah, I just want to say thank you so much to Mayor, Adam, Gracie. It's been fantastic. and also massive apologies to everyone, but Saskia Sassen hasn't been present. Would you like to say anything?
Yeah, just briefly. I mean, I will say, you know, it's very important when we talk about what academics can do, that we shouldn't forget about some of the histories of our disciplines as well. I mean, sometimes we forget where, you know, the science of race is not something that was done, you know, in a market or in a shop. It was the product of academia of its time. So it's actually, there is a job to do, also an academic job, a scholarly job to do, that is our duty. Not to forget it, and this is to do with anthropology, with sociology, with psychology, and a number of. And the other thing I think it's important is that there is a really gap in understanding how the new digital technologies operate in this new politics of surveillance. There is the need of a technical knowledge as well to do decoding and deciphering. And the decoding, I'm also sort of citing a bit Stuart Tool, you know, decoding racism. So there is something work to do there that is also part of our everyday scholarship. So I wish to thank you everyone for attending. It's been fascinating, and thank you, Adam, thank you, Maya, and thank you, Gracie. And hope you will join us also for our next event of the Social Scientists Against the Hostile Environment. Thank you, everyone. Bye.